hype the crowd up before the meeting.
I'm picking out more podcasts.
See, I think it could match that.
You see what they do at baseball and basketball.
But since it's broadcast, it
T-shirt
has to
and
be license free. Oh, yes.
royalty free.
He knows how to find it.
Yeah, I got the good stuff.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the study session of the City Commission. Those in the audience, which is mostly staff, glad to have you here, and board members of the DDA. Also to the public who are watching us tonight. I'd like to start this meeting to acknowledge that the land on which we gather is the territory of the Ottawa and Chippewa peoples who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. We thank you for your strength and resilience in protecting this land and inspiring us to uphold our responsibility to do the same. With that, Ms. Shamrow, would you lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance? Roll call, please.
Absolutely. Good evening, Commissioner Walter,
Here.
Commissioner Werner. Here. Mayor Pro Tem Shamrow.
Here.
Commissioner Wilson,
Present. Commissioner
Stanley,
Here.
Commissioner Treadwell, and Mayor Lewis.
Here. Okay, announcements from the city manager, please.
Yes, thank you, Honorable Mayor and City Commissioners. First of all, you'll be seeing in the immediate future surveys in regard to the master plan and the mobility plan, and encourage you to help us encourage the community to fill those out. We also have on Wednesday the 14th, and this is a little bit different. It's typically on a Thursday, but the Grand Traverse BPW Board of Public Works will be meeting on the 14th, this Wednesday, at 9 a.m. at the Garfield Township Hall. And then also, I was notified by TCAPS that they would like to come to a presentation, and as you know, there is the ability for them to fill out one of those forms to the clerk's office to discuss their Headley rollback issue, to just educate you on what they're working on. Also, working with the Grand Traverse County maintenance crews, they've started as of today on the committee room, and they're going through a process of refurbishing basically and reconfiguring and updating with some of the technology. First the committee room, then the training room after that, then after that the city commission room. They've assured us that they won't do it around the elections so as to not interfere with any of the ongoings of the county boards and such. So this should all be completed no later than the early part of December from what I've been told. Thank you.
Okay. Announcements from the city clerk, please.
Yes, I have some meetings to announce for this week, the week of September 12th. Traverse City Light and Power Board will meet on Tuesday, September 13th at 5:15 p.m. in this room, which is the Commission Chambers. The Brown Bridge Advisory Committee will meet on Thursday, September 15th at 5:15 p.m. on the second floor training room of the Governmental Center. And then finally, the Downtown Development Authority Board will meet on Friday, September 16th at 8:30 a.m. in the Commission Chambers. The city manager mentioned that we've launched a survey for the master plan and mobility action plan projects. We've set a goal for at least 2,000 people to complete that survey, and it can be accessed on the city's website. And then it was announced today that following in the footsteps of our I Voted and Future Voter Sticker Design Contest, we've now launched a first-time voter sticker contest. And that's because in the August election, we had a significant number of first-time voters, and we want to celebrate that as much as possible. And artists are encouraged to submit their designs between now and September 28th, and then there will be a public vote to select the winners. And folks can visit our city website, click on the news icon, and find out more information. And then last week, we streamed the City Commission meeting live on our Facebook page. It had about 1,000 views just within a couple of days, which is another way to drive up transparency. So now that's going to be a routine thing for City Commission and Planning Commission meetings. And then we're also now streaming live on the city's YouTube channel, so folks can go to City of TC on YouTube and find us there. Meetings will also be played back on that YouTube channel as well. And then last thing is my usual reminder for everyone sitting up here to please speak into the microphone, and that's all that I've got. Thank you.
Anyway, okay, with that, we'll start on our items for the study session. We have 4 items before us tonight. The first one is an update regarding modification to the Clinton Park splash pad. So I'll turn this over to you, Marty, to get this started, please.
Certainly, thank you. Back in 2013, basically the city had finalized an upgrade, a new splash pad down at Clinch Marina, Clinch Park area. There was an incident at the end in terms of technical aspects with some of the engineering and design work and the hookups, and we went through a legal process in which there was a settlement, and the city had been paid some dollars for future improvements to the specific issues within basically the cleaning system, the water system, to clean it, backflush it, and make sure that it's safe and sanitary. So we're at that point now, and I'm going to ask that Michelle Hunt, our Parks and Rec Superintendent, come up and give a little bit more detail as to the process that we're following and what we're recommending to you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. So I want to start this off by when I started my position almost a year ago now, who can believe it, I asked staff for feedback on what was working well within the Parks Division, what wasn't working well, things that they would like to see improved. And the splash pad came up numerous times in conversation with actually other city staff members, not just in parks, but many times the splash pad came up as something for, wishful improvements that could happen. This is something that was ongoing before I arrived. So this project is not necessarily it's new to me, but it's been something that's been developing prior to my arrival. And it's been in the works for a few years, and I sort of just kind of picked it up and moved along with it. We have previously worked with the company Vortex that I talked about in my memo back in about 2016, 2017, so they were previously familiar with the splash pad. What I want to highlight is that these are improvements to enhance the features that are existing at the splash pad, but also add some new features to the splash pad so that we can get it a little more automated and make sure that when staff does work at the splash pad, they're able to have a little bit more confidence that the chemical that's going to be fed into the splash pad is being fed in at the right, like how it's supposed to be, as the hours that it's open from 11 a.m. to 7 p.m. every single day. And then some of the new features that Vortex suggested, in which I'll back up and say Vortex is one of the leading industry professionals for splash pads in the entire world, actually. They install splash pads all over the world. And when they came to the splash pad in July, they looked at all of our systems. They didn't have access to the as-built at that time, but I gave them to them afterwards. So they became very familiar. We did a full walk around. We looked at all the systems. So they were recommending based on what we had, and I just asked, I said, can you upgrade us? What would you do if you could fix our pumps, fix the chemical controller, fix the chemical feed, fix it to where what we've been trying to do with companies in town, we reached out to, like, when you install a pool in your backyard, that's who we've been previously working with. They have been very helpful, but the issue that we were finding was that since our system is a little bit more specialized, how it was designed, we couldn't quite get there with a pool company. We needed someone who knew things about splash pads. And what Vortex is able to do is they're able to install things to sense the rain, sense the weather, and shut down the system. Because right now, if it's raining, we have to go manually shut it down. What this will do is we can set it to where if it's 65 degrees or if it's raining, it'll automatically turn off. Systems that are put in place to help save water, save energy, and also there's another feature that we're really excited about where after 4 minutes, the splash pad turns off. So right now, the water runs all day, well, not all day, it's 11 a.m. to 7 p.m., and then it turns off. And if there's no kids playing in it, the water's still continuously running, which means we have to continuously add more chemical because it's a closed system. Now what will happen, or hopefully what will happen, is if a child or anyone wants to go play, they go up and they push a button, and then the water will turn on, and it'll run for 4 minutes, and then it'll shut off. And then you go up and you push the button again, and then it will run for 4 minutes. So, more sustainable way to keep the water running. And they actually didn't recommend that we install a new holding tank because they said this will dramatically decrease the amount of chemical and water you use if you install this activator button. So just wanted to highlight some of the really great features because this company has been doing this for quite some time. And I reached out to other companies other municipalities who have splash pads to get a feel for how much staff time do you spend on your splash pads, how much of an issue have your splash pads been. They didn't really have many comments on that because they don't have a lot of issues. They are sort of a self-reliant system, which we don't have. And that's what we're looking to do. So I can elaborate on any of the features or what we're looking to accomplish. I wanted to make sure you understood because it is a little bit of a larger sum of money, but the upgrades are to make sure that we can go to a more automated system, as I mentioned.
You got in here, is this also a feature that's going to be added, this Cascade River?
Yes, it's an interactive play feature for children that we don't quite have one of those. Mostly they're independent features, and this is a way for it's 2 functions. One is for the water to cycle back through, and then the other is for kids to play together.
All that's good, but that's included in the price, correct?
Correct.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any questions?
Thanks for looking into this. When it came up recently about, I think, the HVAC system there, I thought, well, how could it be that old already that we need to make improvements? But I understand that time has been flying by. And I remember when it was installed and my kids were toddlers, so that makes sense. And we have checked out a lot of the other area splash pads too and enjoyed that feature, the button. How long, looking into the future, how long do you think these upgrades will benefit the system? Is there an estimate from Vortex on, the technology or what that might look like going forward?
When I talked, they call it it's their Maestro Pro controller, and it actually has Wi-Fi, and I don't have that timeline for you, but I can speak to what's going to be nice what we don't have now and what we will be able to do with this Pro controller, and that's what we've been trying to upgrade all summer, and while we were working with the pool companies. So we'll have the Wi-Fi down there and the controller. I'll actually be able to pull it up on my computer in my office or on a tablet or a Parks employee can put it on their tablet in like a truck or somewhere. So it'll give us a lot more access to the splash pad from other locations. And that's the kind of technology that, we're way over here in this technology is leaps and bounds of where we're at. So in terms of how long that would last, I don't have an answer on that, and I can find out that answer. But this will allow us to control and monitor all of that at a much more accurate scale than we're doing now.
Great,
So,
thanks.
yeah.
Any other questions? Good. I think it's a good step forward. This is kind of what you set the money aside for. I did ask the city manager, I remember the settlement when it got taken place. I just didn't remember where the money got put, but it was put into a special account to be held for purposes like this. So it's not like this is coming out of the general fund, but it's been set aside for this particular type of activity in that area. So there's a little bit more funds that in the future, if something else comes along, a good idea or better technology as 10 years rolls down the road, which you'll still be here. Most of us probably won't be, so you can be worried about that then. So take it from there. So, okay. If no one has any questions, are we planning on having this on our agenda next week to move forward? Okay. And if you can get the question that Ms. Walter asked, if you can get that, how long will this technology last us? 5 years, 10 years, or?
I can email that out to
Well, you can put
Marty.
it in your
Sure.
overall, just have it in the overall
For
memo.
next Monday. I can
for
do that.
Monday.
Sure.
Is that fine enough?
Yeah,
Okay,
great.
Thank you. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Good work. We appreciate it. So, Okay, next we have a discussion regarding establishing a neighborhood enterprise zone within the Downtown Development Authority District. I'm going to say right now, while this is talking about, and Gene's leading the discussion on this, this is really creating the ordinance that could be used throughout the city if we choose to use it. While it's been brought up by the DDA for a particular property that may be able to use it or not use it, as I shared in a previous note, I think through the ticker, or maybe it's the record he got, I don't remember, about this is nothing more than an extra tool that we'll have in our toolbox. Whether we use it or don't use it, or how we use it's going to be up to this body. But because there's an idea for within the downtown area, the DDA has been working on it, but also the board and the Finance Committee doesn't want to go any further unless they feel like the City Commission is on board with proceedings, because they can't implement it, only the City Commission can do so. But we want to look at the tool, at least I believe, if there's something that we're interested in, it should be a tool that could be used citywide, not just in the downtown. So with that, should I just go ahead and turn it over to Gene and let her get started?
Certainly, she's taking the lead with Mr. Jeff Smoke, who is working on a project downtown.
Okay.
Good evening, City Commissioners. My name is Jean Dorenzi. I'm the CEO of the Traverse City Downtown Development Authority. And as Mayor Lewis indicated, that the DDA has looked at housing, of course, as a priority to have year-round residents in downtown Traverse City. And part of that is looking at the tools that are available. I know that Sean Winter has talked to you previously about other tools that are available. But this particular tool, the Neighborhood Enterprise Zone, is available to some communities within the state of Michigan, and Traverse City is one of them. One of the developers that is looking at 124 West Front Street has asked us to look at a Neighborhood Enterprise Zone for that site. But instead of just looking at that site specific, we really wanted to look, we being the DDA, wanted to look at being a little bit more proactive and looking at the downtown as a whole, and possibly working with Sean and looking at the city for areas that we're looking at for this neighborhood enterprise zone to get into, I would say, the 70% to 120% of the area median income, which Yarrow Brown will talk about a little bit more. But I tried to identify what the neighborhood enterprise zone is. It is a tax incentive. It's a reduction in the taxes on the housing components. So if it's a mixed use, it's only on the housing that would be a reduction in the taxes that is we're looking for. It's not specifically on just the low and moderate income, the 70% to the 120. It would be in all of the housing units. But we're getting more of that missing middle component. I call this a missing middle than other aspects that we have. So the DDA has done some work, and we appreciate the tool. We like the tool. We think that it would work. But we really wanted to bring in Housing North to talk with us about it. They have sent a letter of support for utilizing this tool, as well as I think it's important to use our advocacy and our nonprofit Housing North to talk through some of the challenges that they see on getting housing into downtown Traverse City and the city as a whole. So before I ask for questions, I'll ask Yarrow, if it's okay with you, Mayor, to talk a little bit more about the tool and what this would be utilized for the area median incomes. Yarrow?
Thanks, Jean. Hi, nice to see you all. Can you hear me okay? I'm a little shorter than Jean. I also don't have high heels on. So I just wanted to point out that this is a tool, like she said, that is unique to Traverse City right now. It's one of the few cities in our region that can use this tool, but we are working statewide. It's a statewide initiative for the Housing Michigan Coalition to bring this tool to all communities in Michigan, because it is a really important tool to help incentivize housing. So we are in a situation, as many of you know, which has gone from a housing crisis, I would say, to an emergency. And in Grand Traverse County, I'm going to pull up my notes here, but the area median income, so this would, depending on the size of the unit or the family unit, we're probably thinking these would be 1 to 2 bedroom apartments. It would serve people making between $49,000 a year, all the way up to about $84,000 a year. So that's kind of that missing middle from 80 to 120% of the area median income. While we do need, housing across the spectrum, we do feel like this is a huge gap in our region where there are tools and resources and incentives that can help bring housing to our region. So we really stand by this tool. Right now, we just sent out an announcement through the Housing Michigan Coalition and Housing North where these bills that are actually hoping to expand not just the NEZ tool, but the pilot bill we're hoping to get on the House floor. So I'll also forward that to the city manager if anybody's interested, but these are really huge opportunities, especially for Northwest Michigan, where we have really limited tools to be able to bring in development to our region, particularly for housing. So right now, I will just say it's impossible to build a housing that is affordable to most of those who live and work here year-round without providing some sort of incentive. So I would really encourage the city to consider putting this tool to use, as well as supporting, any efforts to expand this tool to other cities, townships, and municipalities. I don't know what else I can add to that, except that thank you for your time and happy to answer any questions that you have.
The numbers you did was for a single individual.
That was for a single and a 2-person family,
Okay.
but those were for.
But, so there's ranges for families of 4, so it goes up, how much you can qualify for. So.
Yeah, depending on the unit. So for a 4-person family, that would be for somebody making, based on the area median income, about $70,000 to $106,000, but that would actually make housing attainable to them in the region right now.
But, but that would be if both husband and wife or partner.
Exactly. That would be a 4-person family, so likely a 2 to 3 bedroom
Just so you know. So.
unit. And I'm happy to share this information as well as our letter of support to the DDA for this program.
Okay. Jean, you want to?
We're looking for your input and how you want to move forward, if you like this tool, if you want us to investigate it further. Putting this in place helps development or private investors know that this is an area that the Traverse City Commission is looking for housing and will work with them for this tool. So having it located on a parcel, or as identified, you have to have 10 adjacent platted parcels to be able to look proactively at sites to put this as an overlay on the property would help get developers interested in providing that housing. It would be an agreement that you would enter into with the private developers, so it's pretty stringent to know that it's going to be a 15-year, or do you want a 10-year, do you want an 8-year? You have to at least have 6 years, but it doesn't go longer than 15. So there's lots of components that you can put into place, and it is a legal instrument that you would enter into with the private developer.
Good. Anyone got any questions?
Some Mark and I with their hands up too.
No, my hand was up, but you jumped and asked it. So.
Excuse me?
You already asked the question that I was going to ask.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that was just pure luck. Yeah.
Well,
Yes.
So my question was that this originated out of a request from a developer looking at 124 West Front Street.
Correct.
So, you are looking at this as something applicable throughout the city of Traverse City rather than just that particular parcel?
Correct. That's what we'd like to do, Commissioner Stanley, is to look at it more proactively and not just as somebody comes in and asks. It's a long process, but it's also, we know we want housing, so can we look at this differently and proactively to identify the sites that we're looking at?
And so is the platted, was it 10 platted sites that are contiguous, is that a requirement for the city to be eligible for the NEZ, or is that a requirement for having a neighborhood enterprise zone established, that you have to have those that are developable?
It's within the legislation that it has to have 10 adjacent and contiguous platted parcels. So it's not a parcel, it's platted.
Okay,
Platted parcels.
thank you for
Yeah,
clarifying.
you gotta have, y'all gotta be together, so if there's a parcel of land out there, someone could put together 10 parcels, together, then it can be used. The main reason, whichever, if we were just to stay with the DDA or we go citywide, it's an ordinance that has to be developed and adopted by the city commission to be enacted. So if you're going to do this, why not make it for the city? I've made it clear in discussions at the DDA that, you know, I'm going to be looking at it 15 years, because if we're going to grant this, I'd like to get as much use or get as much affordable housing units as we can for the longest period that we can. So, but that's just one person. I made that clear also. So if you think it's interesting, input right now would be wonderful. If you've got some concerns, it'd be great that they could hear those, Gene and company could hear that now, so they can be working on those and see if they can be resolved. So, yes.
I know there was some discussion about this when it had previously come to the DDA, but on that subject of 10 platted parcels, how many are in the currently circumscribed zoning district that you have laid out?
If it was just for the 124 West Front Street, that's 11 platted parcels, so that
Okay.
parcel would be eligible.
But if we go for the whole city, then it would be thousands of parcels.
You don't know.
Right, you'd be strategic on locations, on where you'd want the NEZ to be.
Any other questions or concerns?
You didn't have,
You can go, it's fine.
okay. Couple questions. So, you know, more tools in the toolbox, the better, I think, because we don't have that many right now. So definitely interested in getting more information on it. Question about, you know, the focus on the missing middle. We know there's a housing need on, you know, across the spectrum. But why, you know, financially is it the focus on the missing middle versus, you know, somewhat lower income? Is that the feedback from developers, or is that it just makes more sense? Like, why the particular interest there?
It's not so much the interest, Commissioner Walter, it's more of what's the realistic number that you can get to and to achieve. So the 53% reduction in the taxes, can you get to 60 and below? What most development throughout the state is you're not going to be able to get there. So that's why we're saying, will it be 60 and below? It's possible, but maybe not with this tool, but with other tools possibly, like through the low-income housing tax credit, you can do that. But so each tool is different and unique, and being able to achieve certain elements and certain AMIs. Do you have a?
No, I mean, I think that's right. This tool is particularly designed, I guess, for a different range of area median income, but that if the numbers work, it could be for, you know, for lower income levels. But I think this is one tool that is designed probably more for the missing middle in this case. But it is, the other programs that do tend to focus on the lower income housing tend to be a lot more competitive. And, you know, right now, we basically need all the tools we can get to provide, you know, any type of housing. So it's just one of the tools that probably to make it work, you would focus on the missing middle, as Jean said.
So follow up, in other communities where this is working, what sort of agreements are in place with the municipality and the landowner who's getting the tax break to ensure that that's passed on to the apartment renter versus just the developer keeping the tax break? How is that built into it?
It's built into the agreement that you'd have a third-party oversight to ensure that those apartments are meeting the requirement that is put into place. So is that the City Housing Commission? Is that a nonprofit? But you'd have that third-party consultant ensure that all of those units that you've identified are needed are maintained.
And who pays the third party to ensure that happens?
I've seen it in different agreements, but typically it's the development that requires that third party.
Thank you.
Mr. Warner?
Yeah, I'm only going to speak once tonight because I'm nervous, so I'm going to read it. Items 2, 3, and 4, I'll start with the word discussion. And if the city commission is truly supposed to discuss items, we should be provided with the best information possible. In 3 cases this evening, we are only provided with single points of view: the neighborhood enterprise zone, the two-way State Street, and the SRO for TCAPS. Having well-reasoned counter-arguments to aid in city commission discussions would only help city staff perform at the highest possible level. It is a disservice to city staff and the community to not have well-reasoned discussions based on the best information possible. Thank you.
Ms. Shamrow?
Yes, I had a question about this. So it was mentioned in the presentation, granted, this was kind of a dense 2-pager in here, so maybe I missed it, or maybe I misheard, but that it was a minimum percent, there is no minimum percentage that, I guess basically during the presentation, I thought I heard somebody, Jean say that the entire parcel doesn't have to be at the reduced rate, and it would, the tax break applies to every unit, or did I mishear that? So that's what I wanted to clarify.
So if it's a mixed-use building, so it's a commercial with residential above, the commercial would not have the NEZ attached to it, just the housing component, just the housing units.
So the NEZ applies to the entire commercial, or I'm sorry, to the entire residential.
The entire residential.
Does the, but the, any kind of commercial would not have anything from the NEZ applied to it, or it does have the tax break?
Would not have the tax break.
Okay, so, thank you, that was what I was looking to clarify, because I want to make sure we weren't getting into a percentage issue where 3 units out of 15, let's say, could be affordable and they'd get this NEZ tax break.
Well, the residential units would get the tax break.
That's what I meant, sorry, of the residential.
So the residential units would get the tax break, and you would identify how many of those units would have the restricted area median income,
Okay, so it does apply to every unit, then would get the tax break.
the residential units.
Okay. Is there something we can do in that, as this ordinance moves forward or something moves forward, what kind of controls do we have locally? We can, for example, say 15 years versus 6. Are there any controls on percentages of the
Yeah.
units that we would say would have to be within this missing middle income zone for qualifications, or does the state limit us from doing that?
No, it would be under your control.
Okay.
To say you want, of the 15, you want 13, or you want 10. How many, that would be up to between you and the development team to negotiate into a legal instrument, a legal agreement.
If this is an ordinance we're going to put forward through, though, are we allowed to pass the ordinance saying 75% minimally will be qualified for them to even apply to us, or do we have to do it on case-by-case basis? I'm picking these numbers off the
I
top of my
think
head, but.
putting out the requirements and the goals of the city commission is always good, to let the development know that this is your goal. So 75% of the units, that the residential units would have to be restricted. So that way, the development team knows that anything less than 75% don't even think about using this tool.
And just so everybody's clear, because this happens a lot, I use 75% on a whim. When we have
Right.
these discussions again in the future, please don't say Commissioner Shamrow said she wants 75%. I think we could even go higher, but I just wanted to use that out there as an example.
Understood?
Let me ask a clarifying question here. We have an apartment complex that's got 25 residential units being put in. We come up, and I'll just use the number 50% just because it's easy in my head. So we're saying that 12 of those units we want to be restricted. Is the tax reduction just on those 12 units or on all 25 units?
All 25.
Okay, thank you. I missed that point earlier, and thank you very much. Thanks for your question, Amy. Appreciate it. Okay.
Mayor?
Yes.
Kind of going to it, excuse me. Was going through the questions that Commissioner Shamrow had referenced. Basically, every development, it's very seldom that there's two alike. And so having the different tools available can help fit a project maybe a little differently or a little better. One of the things that we ask is we take a look at their pro forma and we ask the questions, what's the gap that you're trying to fill? You don't want somebody relying, say, 80% on that project on your tax base for the next 50 years, unless it's meeting some goals, but that's not typical is my point. it's usually a gap that's manageable. It's a set amount. And so then you look at what tools you have available and what may fit, whether it's the amount of parcels, the location of the parcels, whether it's a pilot that may work better with their pro forma and the piece of land versus this, or an OPRA. There's a number of different tools available to you out there. But I think it is important to note that, and even though it's spelled out in here, that in the last 3 years, you see that escalation of taxes being paid. So it's not just 15, it's really 12, and then the vast majority of taxes are paid thereafter with just a slight amount given back at that point. And basically, you're weaning them off of that process and getting them to plan for what they need to do financially back into their programming for that particular property. Now, we have had an NAZ before, and I wasn't here when it was established, but was when it was closing up and finishing. And there was a problem that arose, and I want to make sure you're aware of that. There is paperwork that is to be filled out by the developer or the property owners. That's their obligation, their requirement to get these benefits. And they, for whatever reason, did not turn in their paperwork. We don't track that specifically because that's a relationship between the state and the property owner. And when it expired, they were in a panic, didn't fit their pro forma as they saw it. And all of a sudden, I'm getting phone calls from the state legislators and their staff saying, how come we're doing this to them? We're not doing anything. We're following the state law. And basically, I had to tell the legislative staffs, follow the law. This is the law the legislature made. If you guys want a change or an amendment into it to give them the break after the fact, that requires state legislature. So again, I point this out because this was a problem in our community just several years ago when that particular property owner did not turn in their paperwork. So that is their responsibility. Just want to make that very clear.
I think, and I'm not blaming anything, but I think we can all remember up in the Commons that was kind of but I think it was a different program, but for a number of years, income taxes and different taxes did not have to pay if they had a work site or owned property up there while it was being developed. So that has since expired. So I remember it was about 15 years. In the last 3 years, it seemed like this. I don't know if it was actually an NEZ or something else, but it was something close. So
It's a Renaissance zone.
okay. Huh?
That was a Renaissance zone.
A Renaissance zone, something like that. Yeah, same thing. Okay. Any other questions? Yes.
So if Mr. Winter is looking, at developing other zones across the city and comes back to say this might be a good one or this might be a good one, so any existing platted parcels, is that the term, that exist would automatically be included in that? Or do they opt in? Like, how does that process work?
You would identify the locations at the time that you would adopt the ordinance for the resolution of the NEZ. So these parcels, these platted parcels are identified within your NEZ zone.
So it could be, randomly a single-family home that is just in that zone, or, I'm just thinking what could happen, right, if somebody is all of a sudden getting a tax break on their property taxes that they weren't otherwise getting? Is that a
But you would,
possibility?
no,
Okay.
because it's not new development, so you're not going to place an NEZ on a single-family residential. You're really looking at the corridors components or where you want to redevelop. And then if there's new investment, then you would work with that developer or with the homeowner that's looking at building up or building out. That's when you'd start working with them.
Okay, because it does say in here, part of the, under the MBDC information that, part of the reason to establish it is to rehab additional residential housing.
So if you could go into a neighborhood, but they would have to put that investment in, but it'd still be an agreement between you and that homeowner. So they don't automatically get the break. So is it achieving your goals of affordability?
But at the time of drafting the ordinance and putting it in place, we don't have to identify where all those zones are. That comes afterwards. Where all the possible development areas could be, or where we would place.
No, not afterwards. You don't just have an ordinance that says you want an NEZ. You would identify the locations at the same time.
Okay. All right. The possible locations.
The possible locations.
All right. Are we willing to proceed this forward to see where it works its way through? Okay. I know Gene will work with Sean to see what possibilities, so
Well,
I see heads nodding up and down.
I'm nodding, but I would say that for me to want to go through with this in the long term, I'd want to know what everything looks like with high percentage requirements. So, I'm in favor of it. I do think we need all the tools that we need,
Yeah.
but I also don't want something coming to me where somebody can have 3 affordable units and build, a whole other condo, and all of those are going to get that tax break. So, and I say that because when it comes back, I know sometimes we get things that say, for example, when we were debating the short-term rental policies that we created a couple years ago, okay, well, most developers are telling us that if you do more than this or less than this, it's not going to be feasible anyway, so it's dead in the water. So I guess I'm looking for a little of that insight as we go forward. I don't need precise, crystal ball predictions, but I'd like to know how high we can go and still expect there to be some movement with this, or is it going to be such a low number that we might not want to proceed in the long run? So just to put that out there ahead of time while you guys move forward.
I agree. So I said, if you could have 6 to 15, I want 15. I want the most that we could possibly get.
Right.
Okay, if we're going to give tax breaks and we're going to get criticized for it, I want the most that we can possibly accomplish for that, so.
If I may, I know that we encourage through the pilot use some of the goals as well as for green activities. I would recommend that we include that in this process as well.
Okay. Jane, did that get what you need for now?
Just on clarification from Commissioner Shamrow, what you're looking when it comes to percentage, you're looking at percentage of units.
Yes.
Okay.
Or, however that gets sliced out within the NEZ.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Next is a discussion regarding the circulation study for downtown. So who's leading that discussion? Go back to Gene again.
Honorable Mayor and City Commissioners, just real quickly, the DDA, having discussions previously, went and proceeded forward to hire a consultant to work with the DDA and their committee on identifying what may or may not work. There's been a study completed, and they're going to go over and review some of the outcomes of that particular investigation. Ms. Jean Dorenzier, CEO of DDA.
Thanks, Marty. I appreciate that introduction. Good evening again. We are here today for discussion purposes with the City Commission to get your feedback into circulation on State Street and Boardman, from Pine to Boardman, and looking at a two-way circulation. The DDA really is looking at this holistically. Today I have with me Steve Nance from the DDA board and Michael Brodsky from the board, as well as Sean Winter, city planner, Harry Burkholder, COO, Chris Zuhl from Progressive AE, Progressive AE worked with us on circulation studies, as well as what it is currently and what it would be and what the effect would be on circulation as well. This was really a collaborative approach when it comes to, when you look at the circulation, we included the DPS department, city engineer, and city planning, as well as with all DDA operations when we're looking at new programs. It's really very inclusive and public engagement. So we have to have public engagement when it comes to programs that we're looking at, as well as historical when it comes to two-way streets. We needed to really get and dig into some data components. So why are we pursuing this conversion? We're really looking at it because of the goals and objectives of the DDA being pedestrian access, mobility, as well as the public space. So when it comes to that public space, how are we making it accessible to them, as well as pedestrians and mobility? That too is a city commission goal and objective to look holistically at this. And better connectivity into the grid system. And when I say the grid system, how are we connecting to other parts of the DDA district and the city as a whole? Currently, we have one-way round. We have State Street and Front Street, and we're really looking at better connectivity into that grid system. And the DDA always looks to encourage private investment within our commercial area. And we see the State Street as opportunity for that private investment to occur to slow that traffic, as well as look at different opportunities for the State Street area. And the last bullet point, a desire to implement a best practice, it's really start looking at this is not a through thoroughfare, but a to. And that's a big difference, and it's not about getting through downtown, it's about getting to downtown and connecting to other areas within the city. We started pursuing the conversation relative to when we started looking at the East Front Street design, that we wanted to look at East Front Street and the two-way circulation as well. Not just, we looked at Front Street, State Street, Boardman, and basically the circulation as a whole to really move downtown into the right direction. Not that it's in the wrong direction now, but could we improve upon what we have? And we also had some data points from the circulation and the two-way pilot that we did on State Street in the summer of 2020. That was only from Union to Park Street, but we have some data points and some understanding that, one, it does work, but we know we have to really look at other avenues to make this a successful operation. But it's also important to look at what's coming up, that we know that the traffic signals on State Street are end of their useful life and they're going to be replaced soon. And we also know that the Hardy parking deck equipment is going to be replaced in the next 2 to 3 years. So this is an opportunity to not just be a catch-up and reactive. It's more of let's look at State Street more proactively and look at this as a pilot operation to see how we can do this and can we do this with the new technology that is coming in place. As well as we know that we have a mobility plan that you just identified as going out for survey, that the mobility piece is important when you're looking at State Street as well and the whole downtown. So those three pieces were critically important when we're starting this conversation. We wanted to start it early instead of later. So the objective you have, but we want to go into the methodology on looking at the historical and case study research. It was data-driven approach. We have much data that we can go into with you. And the public engagement. And I know that we say public engagement, but how we do this is different than what has been historically done, that we really reach out to the public, we go to the public instead of asking them to come to us. And we looked at alternatives for the downtown and how it connects and protects the neighborhoods. We don't want this to go through neighborhoods as well. We want to protect those neighborhoods that we have adjacent to the downtown. When we presented this to the DDA board, they wanted to really dig into the data a little bit more. So they established a subcommittee, and Steve Nance was the chair of that subcommittee, along with Michael Brodsky was on the committee, and Jeff Gibran. And they wanted to take a deeper dive to make sure that the goals and objectives that staff presented really did achieve that pedestrian and the mobility component and the activities that we identified. So it's their recommendation, not just staff-driven. It's really about the board digging into this and understanding the goals and objectives of this recommendation that's brought before you, but really looking at your feedback. We know that this has been a one-way since 1967, but is it time to really look at a two-way circulation on State Street? So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Harry and Sean and Chris to go through the case studies and the data, and Steve and Michael will round it up with the recommendation and get your feedback. So thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Harry Burkholder with the DDA. Just to reiterate part of the bullets that Jean just went through, and essentially doing our homework is looking at case studies and national trends in terms of a lot of communities across the United States have been rethinking how they do one-way streets to two-way streets in their downtowns. I'd say for the last 30 years, it's really been a movement across the United States, going back to that notion of designing a destination going to versus going through downtowns. It coincides with rethinking how the automobile moves throughout the downtown streets, and then really supporting more of a pedestrian movement, which we've done here in Traverse City to a great extent. So some of the case studies that we looked at, over 78 throughout the United States, have now essentially restored their downtown streets to two-way travel. So this is a trend that we're seeing, again, in the United States, but also in the state of Michigan. If you've been looking at some of the news, and some of our larger downtown or downstate communities, the city of Kalamazoo and the city of Lansing, are currently looking at changing their one-way downtown streets to two-way streets. So very much in tune with a lot of the trends and best practices that are happening throughout the United States. Looking at those trends, no different than what we had here in Traverse City. As Jean mentioned, this started in the spring of 1967. Based on our homework, that conversation to go from two-way to one-way in 1967 lasted about 15 years. So there was a lot of debate then, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of debate now. But again, it was that mentality of how we design streets and traffic and accommodate pedestrians is totally shifted to what we did in the 60s to what we do now. And so that's why we're having that discussion. Again, thinking of that to versus through conversation and where we want to be here in Traverse City.
Thank you, Harry. Sean Winter, City Planning Director, and I'll just start by saying, as your planner, I strongly support the recommended two-way street conversion for two reasons. The first is going to be best practices in the planning profession. One-way streets promote the fast, efficient movement of cars over all other modes, sacrificing pedestrians, economic development, placemaking, and other community benefits. It's important to recognize that one-way streets are an outcome of some of our past land development regulations in this country. After World War II, we really focused on the strict separation of uses. So you had housing, commercial, industrial, institutional, office, much like a toddler's dinner plate, if you will. And what this did is this forced people to drive for all of their needs. Naturally, people wanted that drive to be more efficient and for it to be quicker. So some of the approaches that the people of the past took for this was to sometimes punch a highway right through a city, or if possible, acquire more right-of-way for more lanes, or in a restrained development pattern such as a downtown, flip the streets to two ways. Today, planners would recognize all of these as, I'd say, failed best practices, and we should probably be focusing on correcting them rather than continuing to embrace them, because we've learned since the 60s, the 50s, the 40s, the negative impact that some of these approaches are having on our communities. I'd also add that there are many benefits of a strong transportation grid network, but one of them that stands out with the type of network we have in Traverse City is resiliency. Whether you have an incident, an event, a construction project that closes a street, an open grid system allows that traffic to easily be redistributed, so it's not being concentrated on a single street or corridor. So when you do things like close a right-of-way, limit turning motions, make streets one way, you start to chip away at that resiliency and you lose the benefit of the grid system in doing so. The next reason is consistency with our planning and policy documents. So within our master plan, our future land use map classifies downtown as the TC5 downtown neighborhood type. This is the most intensely developed, neighborhood type with the highest level of regional and commercial activity. It recognizes that motor vehicles will be restricted through limiting speeds, parking costs, and access, with instead a focus on pedestrians. Within the transportation element of the master plan, the street form and function section prescribes that the city will provide well-planned connections within the network for efficient distribution of travel, reduce motor vehicle trips and lengths, and promote alternatives to single occupancy vehicles. Two-way streets approach all of these better than one-way streets. Then within our connectivity and hierarchy section of the transportation element, it states that the city will look at the following items in order of priority when designing streets. First being public safety, pedestrians, public transit users, bicyclists, commercial vehicles, carpooling vehicles, and lastly, single occupancy vehicles. What one-way streets do is they flip that upside down and they put the single occupancy vehicles at the top of that prioritization. It could be argued that our master plan is old, which it is, and we're embracing a new master plan right now, but I think most of us recognize that having a safe, efficient, multimodal transportation network in the city is a pretty deeply entrenched value, which is why we're also working on a parallel mobility action plan to better address that. And then lastly, the street design manual classifies these streets as downtown streets, reinforcing the master plan's emphasis on lower vehicle speeds despite having higher volumes, allowing for more pedestrian, bicycle, and transit user access, narrowing lanes and street parking on each side, and having human-scale streetscape amenities, such as trees, public art, plazas, proper lighting, wider sidewalks, mid-block crossings, and so on. And when you look at that document, when it gives a cross-section of a downtown street and how it should be designed, it actually shows a two-way street as the preferred design there. So lastly, one-way streets in our downtown, with their focus on moving motor vehicles in and out of the city as quickly as possible, are inconsistent with our community's vision and values as identified in the master plan and the street design manual, as well as best practices in the planning profession. Thanks.
As Gene mentioned, leading off, really, one of the sole reasons why we're looking at this is really creating a downtown that's better for pedestrians. But it also has a lot of other rationale and other benefits that are related to transition from one-way to two-way streets. And I'll let Chris talk about the efficiency when he talks a little bit about the data. I want to quickly go over some of the other benefits. The first one being an economic benefit. And we had a lot of discussion, especially at our subcommittee, about is it a chicken and egg? If you do the street, does that automatically mean new economic development? And I think it's way more complex than that. Some of the examples that you see here from other states definitely show that there's an economic value to switching from one-way to two-way streets, decreased vacancies in first-floor buildings, more user-friendly, new development, increase in retail sales, and that's partly to do because you have more pedestrian movement within those core districts. It's not just the traffic itself, as you can see from some of these photos. It's a combination of streetscaping and traffic calming measures in addition to switching to two lanes or two-way traffic. So I don't want to make it sound like this is the sole answer. It's a combination of a variety of things, really to make those streets more pedestrian friendly. And that's something that we can examine and study as we go further into this kind of two-way pilot that we're proposing, as how would additional mid-block crossings and other pedestrian amenities impact the flow of traffic within State Street and others. And so these are just other examples that we've looked at and were part of our study overall. And we have seen some initial examples of some of that investment. If you look at 8th Street, about a $4.5 million investment within that corridor. That does include the bridge, but we're already looking at over $20 million worth of private investment in 3 years and growing. So we've seen some evidence of that happening here in Traverse City already. The other one is safety, and this really goes back to reducing speeds. When we reduce speeds, we really create a more safe environment for pedestrians and also for vehicles. Some of you may have seen this slide before, that essentially the slower your traffic is, the less likelihood that someone's going to be severely injured or killed from a traffic accident. So having those slower speeds, like Front Street, will reduce some of those pedestrian conflicts. Overall safety is increased throughout the downtown. It also provides for more options if you have a trouble spot, say there is an accident or there is an area where you need to get close, maybe Front Street for an evening or for a weekend. It does provide for greater safety and efficiency of moving traffic through downtown, also going back to that movement of pedestrians. Go ahead, Chris.
Great, thank you, Harry. Good evening, Mayor, Commissioners. My name is Chris Zoll. I'm the Transportation Practice Lead with Progressive AE. Just a brief history and some of my experience. I have a bachelor's and master's degree in transportation engineering from Michigan State University. I spent 15 years as an employee of the City of Grand Rapids, 8 as the traffic safety manager operating the streets in and around downtown Grand Rapids. So as a part of that experience and having the opportunity to look at these conversions, this is a conversation that we've been having for some time, as well as in Grand Rapids, and you're seeing it in other communities as well. It was referenced earlier, the City of Lansing just this summer implemented changes to one-way streets. I think they changed the conversion of 4 streets. I was talking to the City of Lansing's traffic engineer a couple of weeks ago, asking how it's going, and he says the sky hasn't fallen, that indeed the operation is working well, and that they're satisfied with the change. The City of Kalamazoo is also they've made the decision to make the conversion, and we're working with the City of Kalamazoo on changing their streets to two-way operation through the design process right now. In making this decision, you're looking at pros and cons, right? We want to talk about the benefits and the cons of one-way operation versus two-way operation. You've heard some of the history on when the change was made. It was controversial back in the 60s when it was being changed to one-way. It's controversial today. We learned that as a part of our process where we're engaging the public and getting a lot of feedback. One-way streets offer greater vehicle capacity, generally faster throughput. There are fewer conflict points at intersections, and you only have to look one direction as a pedestrian when you're crossing a street. But two-way streets offer slower vehicle speeds. Accidents that do occur are generally less severe. Fewer vehicles are circulating, looking potentially for parking, and it is more common and more intuitive to operate under a two-way system in the downtown. On-street parking on the right side is more natural to drivers than on the left side with a one-way street. So some of the cons to a one-way system is they are less common, they are less intuitive. It does require more signage, and vehicles travel the wrong way down one-way streets routinely. They are less direct and do require additional circulation through the downtown. Some of the negatives of a two-way operation is that there is less vehicle capacity. There is increased vehicle delay versus compared to a one-way system. The traffic signals are more complex. We're controlling more directions of travel, and there are more conflict points at intersections. So, as a part of our process, we engage the public in conjunction with the Front Street design, which included 3 different rounds of community engagement. Over 20 public meetings were held. We had over 200 attendees, 2 surveys, and over 900 responses. So the master plan covering the entire city is looking for 2,000 responses, and we got almost halfway there just talking about circulation in the downtown. So the stakeholders that have been engaged included a lot of the municipal staff, community advocates and partners, elected and appointed officials, residents, business owners, business and property owners. So back in May, I presented the results of the traffic study, but we'll go through the parameters again just briefly. We studied the downtown area. These 15 intersections were identified, counted and modeled. We included pedestrian volumes, bike volumes, looked at some crash data for traffic signal warrants analysis, and generally the results were overall good levels of service. So recall that levels of service is a measure of delay, average delay for a vehicle on a scale from A to F, with A being little to no delay and F being significant delay, potentially gridlock. And so our downtown, as currently modeled on a typical summer weekday, is in fairly good operating condition from a level of service standpoint. We did take some travel times for the current and future through the modeling process as well. So we considered 2 different alternatives for the downtown. 1, could we convert all of the streets in the downtown to two-way? And 2, could we convert selected streets or a hybrid traffic pattern that's been described as Pine, State, and Boardman. So this is what the operation would look like in the downtown, everything showing as two-way operation, and boy, did we get a bunch of feedback about this. There was significant concern from the Front Street businesses in particular about changing the operation of Front Street. We talked about the pros and cons, about slower vehicle speeds, and the city's engineering staff presented data about the existing speeds on Front Street, which were averaging about 17 or 18 miles an hour, relatively slow given the volume of traffic. With the feedback that we had gotten from the businesses, the neighbors, and concerned citizens, the recommendation does not include converting all of the downtown streets to two-way, which led to the scenario that was more acceptable of a hybrid option, which was looking at converting Pine, State, and Boardman to two-way operation. So you can see here, this is a map of how that operations would lay out. The operations are acceptable during peak hours, that level of service measure. However, there is more delay than there is today, right? Moving to two-way traffic will slow traffic down. There will be more congestion, if you will, in the downtown. And over time, as the volumes grow, there may require traffic signal improvements at intersections that are currently all-way stops, such as at State Street and Park, and State Street and Boardman. So in considering this change, there are many facets to look at. There are costs to do a pilot. There are costs to make a permanent change. Crash data is an important input to this discussion as well. Maintenance costs, including the equipment, labor, and materials. Primarily, the feedback that we've gotten around maintenance is concern about snow removal in the winter. So we've been engaging with several city staff on this discussion for quite some time, trying to figure out how we could remove snow under a two-way operation in winter conditions. And it is going to be more difficult. It is going to be more challenging than it is today. And then we've also, as presented earlier, looked at data from case studies on economic impacts for making these types of changes. All right, so you've experienced some conversion temporarily already back in 2020. And that pilot was generally well received, which is consistent with the feedback that we received during our engagement process as a part of this study. There are some challenging intersections, Union and State in particular, Pine and Front Street are also going to be challenging. This process is going to require some iteration. As we implement the conversion, there are going to be, I would recommend, that we focus on providing as little of space for the vehicles as possible, recognizing that that's going to constrict some intersections. And eventually, we may determine that additional turn lanes or turn pockets may be needed, where we will have to expand out to allow for those turning movements or potentially restricting those movements as a part of the process. But there is iteration. So in going through this implementation, we're going to need to learn, tweak, adjust, monitor, measure, and gather feedback specifically from city staff, emergency response vehicles, and maintenance crew and operations. So with that, I'd like to bring the subcommittee chairs up to go through the detailed recommendations.
Thank you. Michael, you want to go first?
Sure. Thanks, Steve. Good evening. It's really nice to see you all. My name is Michael Brodsky. I, as Jean and Chris and everyone alluded to, have been on the DDA Circulation Subcommittee. And I couldn't be more supportive of the two-way conversion of State Street. Not only would it provide better connectivity to the downtown grid, which becomes especially important given upcoming and planned construction projects, but it's a proven way to encourage private investment and increase downtown's vitality. I was skeptical at first, in no small part because I'm not an advocate of changing things for the sake of changing things. But upon investigation, it really did become abundantly clear that this represents an urban planning best practice that's been widely adopted, from Duluth to South Bend to Boise to Kalamazoo, as referenced previously. At the end of the day, I think that this discussion largely comes down to what do we want to be optimizing for? Saving vehicular traffic an extra 30 to 60 seconds on their way eastbound out of town, or providing more connectivity to the downtown grid, encouraging private investment throughout our entire commercial district, and trying to make State Street even more dynamic than it presently is. As a city resident who presently lives on State Street, I couldn't be much more supportive of this. And as a DDA board member, I really do think that this represents excellent, low-hanging, and cost-effective fruit that can help us further realize downtown's potential. So that's why I'm an ardent advocate of this recommendation. Want to take it away, Steve?
Thank you, Michael. Commissioner Steve Nance. And I was a self-avowed skeptic during the presentation with the DDA. I asked some questions, including what's the compelling why. And of course, then they put me to chair the committee to look into it deeper, which we did. We had 2 pretty substantial meetings where we got to ask of the consultant, and city staff were there, as well as Sean, some of the information that you have at a fairly deep level. And in the end, the committee came back to the DDA in support. And I'm a convert, and I am also in support of the pilot. I think for me, it is a prudent investment to try. It has 2 go, no-go. So if it does not work, we have an opportunity to revisit and perhaps not do it and continue. I think that it also has a very good chance of success at enhancing State Street for our neighbors, our visitors. It is, and I did reach out to a number of folks, and I also am blessed to get a lot of input from folks, that the folks that were especially more knowledgeable than I in a lot of things, such as mobility, and alternative transportation and traffic calming, thought the 2-way option was worth a go. So the committee, again, did come back in favor of advising the commission that we should move ahead with this pilot. I would also point to, I'm the president of the NOBO Association, to 8th Street, and it took us quite a few years to get that, and it's a enhanced experience for folks. And I think that's the opportunity we have for our neighbors in enhancing State Street in that same way, where the folks engage on a very different level than they used to. So also development, and it was, as was noted, we're seeing development at a much higher pace, and that is part of the DDA's role. So thank you.
Last slide is we're looking for your questions, your input, and what you're looking for to gain additional information if needed to be able to bring this back to you for consideration.
Okay. I'll let Ashley go first, please.
Okay, pilot, what are the metrics we're looking for go, no-go, success for the pilot? What does that look like? Because it sounds like Front Street was already ruled out based on very emotional reaction to turning that into 2-way from business owners and residents. And I've heard a lot of the same very emotional reaction to State Street. So I'm wondering, you know, what kind of metrics are we really going to focus on rather than the loud skeptics?
So it's so for Front Street, yes, part of one of the slides that we identified is that we took the public engagement, but we evaluated it based on many opportunities. So yes, there was opposition to Front Street going to 2-way, but it's very slow on Front Street. So that was a key dynamic, Commissioner Walter, is that the traffic is slow on Front Street. On State Street, it is faster. And that one of the matrix that we're going to be looking at is, are we slowing traffic? Is it more pedestrian friendly? And so is it more dynamic that we can identify within the State Street area? As well as, are we ensuring that there's not through traffic into the neighborhoods? So it's the fatality. So how are we getting the data on the speeds? How are we getting the data on the pedestrian movements? So those are the pieces that we're looking at, and we're going to be evaluating that as we go as well. It's going to be different in the winter as it will be in the spring, as well as the summer. So there's different matrix as we move forward in making sure that we're identifying that so we can determine, is this a pilot that will turn into permanent or does it go back? So those are the 3 data points that we have right now, Commissioner Walter, but we are looking at what are the other matrix that we can measure to be able to determine that this is a success.
Can you repeat those 3 specific data points?
Pedestrian movement,
What does that mean, though?
more pedestrian on State Street, the speed of State Street, is it slowing? And are we reducing the cut-through traffic into the neighborhoods? So we're using Boardman, we're using Cass, and we're using Union. Oh, and plowing for the winter. So how is that working? Is it working or is it not working?
So you got 4.
So there would be 4.
I had winter maintenance.
Winter maintenance is a key piece for our DPS department.
Amy, and then,
So I have 2 questions from throughout, excuse me, from throughout the presentation, so I'll ask them both. I don't know, Mr. Zoll might be the person to answer both. Part of it came from our presentation from our DDA boards. But one was, it was mentioned that we want to leave as little space as possible for vehicles. I assumed that from the presentation that meant moving vehicles, but I'm also curious about parked because as I'm recalling the pilot that you all referenced for 2020, it did seem to slow State Street down, which was great. Again, don't care if it adds a couple minutes to people trying to cross through town. But that didn't leave a lot of room for bikes either, though. And the sidewalks are still very narrow there, so it's not always the most enhanced pedestrian experience either. I looked at the picture that was provided from the town in Indiana. That one looked like it had parking on one side and some bump outs and less use on the other. So is that part of the plan for this? And if so, is that immediate in the pilot? Is that going to be introduced at a certain point? And then my second question, I guess that was tiny ones together on one part. My second larger question, though, is I was mentioned in the presentation from Mr. Brodsky and Steve that upcoming projects, that this would be the best fit. And I'm sure that was looked at, but I'd like to hear a little bit more about that because since during this 2-year proposed pilot, we would be getting the closure of the Parkway. I'm curious how this is the best fit again and best for the matrix that you talked about, including pedestrians, when so much more traffic is potentially going to be moved onto the more local streets. We won't have that cut through for people who might be commuting east to west for part of the summer. So just some thoughts on those questions, please.
You want to take some and I
Yep.
can?
I'd be glad to chime in on that. Thank you for the question. So in regards to the amount of space for vehicles in particular, we had done some modeling that shows there are turning needs at intersections. In order to facilitate levels of service similar to what are operating today, we need to provide left turn pockets for those movements to occur. In talking with the city engineer, we've been discussing how to implement that, and if indeed those turning pockets are absolutely necessary on day one. And so the thinking is to restrict that to just one lane in each direction and see if indeed those turning pockets are absolutely necessary or not.
Sorry, when you say one lane in each direction, you mean that there would be the east-west movement and no turn lanes, or?
Correct.
Okay, that's what I wanted to
Yep,
clarify.
and so that gives us the opportunity through temporary measures to narrow the pedestrian crossing as much as possible, and providing one travel lane in each direction, which would still accommodate the large vehicles delivering downtown, and then cyclists able to use that travel lane as well. So that's what we're talking about, is the starting point for as little of space as we can for vehicles. And the intent of that, too, also is to have little to no impact on parking right from the beginning. So we're trying to not impact parking. To be able to fit those turn lanes in, we may need to pull some of the parking back in order to allow that left turn lane, if needed, to be implemented. Okay.
The other piece that I wanted to, that Sean identified, is that Front Street is 10 feet, the lanes are 10 feet wide, State Street is 12 feet wide. So we do have some wiggle room on that as well.
So I guess I would push that too as well, that it is 10 feet on Front Street, and we also have a dedicated bike lane.
Sure.
So is that part of the design plan for State Street? You mentioned bikes traveling, room for bikes to travel and traffic in the lanes, but do we have dedicated, or is the plan right out the bat to have dedicated bike lanes as well?
So as a part of the pilot, a bike facility on State Street was not a part of the recommendation. I would suggest that we engage the public on the conversion of two-way for the sake of the two-way pilot, and not creating a conversation around this is only happening because we want to implement bike lanes. So as a part of the mobility study that's happening at the same time as the master plan, the future facilities that would be recommended in the downtown area will be covered as a part of that process. So a bike facility, a temporary bike facility, was not planned as a part of the two-way.
So then, just to clarify, as part of this pilot then, so the pilot goes out without the bike facilities or bike lane, but the mobility study comes back and says, we need way more bike access through downtown. We need to eliminate a whole other, one of the lanes of parking on here. Is that feasible in this, or within the next 2 years, let's say? Or, I guess what I'm saying is, like, we're getting these construction done at one time, we're getting some studies done at the same time, we're doing this 2-year pilot. Let's say the pilot succeeds in some of the metrics of slowing the traffic down, things like that. Is there opportunity at the end or some point during this to then factor in these? I guess what I don't want to hear is, well, we did the pilot, it worked, so that's what we're plopping down here for the next 45 years, or 50, I can't do math tonight. Whatever it's been since 1967.
55 years, yes.
So that's what I'm really wanting to hear is, as we're getting some of these studies, is some of the work that's being done, how quickly can these be integrated if this is successful?
Can I respond?
May I input?
Absolutely, please.
So,
You already have a bike lane on State Street. It's on the south side.
Yes.
correct.
You have one. If you're going to eliminate, narrow it down from 12-foot lanes, you can also put a bike lane on the north side. Because bicycles are going to go two ways, but by the same token, bicyclists can also flow with the traffic if you slow them down. So, but just saying, you have one bike lane already, but it's all geared to go in one direction and on one side. Same way with Front Street. If you're going to be in the bike lane, you've got to be on the north side of Front Street.
That's what I was kind of trying to get at, is some of
most
that.
of the time I don't do that. I just kind of go along with the traffic, and they'll just have to wait for me too. That's why I can slow them down to 19 miles an hour.
But I guess to the
So
the
Commissioner.
flexibility of integration, I guess, is what my long way of asking that.
Correct. So the DDA is a partner with the city of Traverse City and has supported the mobility plan. And we have encouraged the support of the mobility plan. So we're looking for the results of that to be able to implement that plan as identified for the city and the downtown. But we are looking at the pilot and the mobility plan and the traffic lights and the new hardware for the Hardy parking deck. So really looking holistically at this together and waiting for the mobility plan to come through doesn't mean that we should wait for the pilot as well. Pilot is going to do different identifiers, as well as just how are we helping the pedestrian, how are we helping the State Street via Vitality. So that, and to answer your question, we're waiting for the mobility plan to be able to implement.
Great. And then, since I'm channeling some of my former colleagues, I did have one other question that, the question about how does this tie into the upcoming project, since we'll probably see a lot more traffic pushed onto our residential or our city streets.
Yeah, so in thinking about the upcoming Parkway project, I suggest asking ourselves about how we want downtown to function. So we recognize that the Parkway is a major connector carrying tens of thousands of vehicles through the area each and every day. I'm pretty certain most of us wouldn't want to put that volume of traffic through our downtown for the purposes of through traffic. So the balance that is being recommended here is more circulation and mobility options, but not increased capacity to handle all of the Parkway traffic that's being impacted. So moving through the downtown with more choices and more mobility options of how to get through downtown helps to encourage slower speeds, but more accessibility without creating that over influx of a whole bunch of through traffic at generally higher speeds.
Ms. Shamrow, are you finished?
I'll yield for now.
Okay. Mr. Treadwell.
Yeah, and I've got a number of questions. I'll ask some of them and allow other people to answer. But going off of what was just said, in terms of enhancing other mobility options, would that include, for example, increased beta service on the Bay Line through higher funding from the DDA or other third-party sources?
Relative to the mobility plan?
Both the mobility plan and with the closure of Grandview Parkway. Because
Yes.
that, I see that as an option to increase capacity of people without increasing the capacity of vehicles.
Yes, we are working with Beta now and in preparation for 2024 in how we are looking at getting people into downtown without another vehicle. So looking at that public transit opportunity to help with the circulation for people. And yes, the DDA and the DDA would be helping with that. The parking subcommittee is working on that now.
And then also dealing with looking forward at changes to our traffic landscape that exists now. Though this might not happen within the 2-year study period, it's not just Grandview Parkway being redesigned, but as the DDA looks at what's happening along the Boardman River with the 100 and 200 block of Front Street, yes, that doesn't see a whole lot of traffic. It sees some through traffic, but not very much. It sees a much more significant deal of parking, employee access, including drop-off of people or and also service deliveries, including trucks, waste removal, etc. Yes, in most of the designs that I've seen, there is at least some service alley access in those designs, but depending on what final design we end up with, a portion of that traffic, of that employee access or service drives could be redirected onto Front Street, which would change traffic patterns through the downtown area in a way that is worth consideration of a forward-looking plan like this.
Mm-hmm.
Also, while I see the from the traffic study that was done, information on the level of service, and I hear numbers about traffic speeds, say Front Street, what you said was 17 and 18 miles per hour, which I would agree is slow enough that it doesn't, that it's comfortable for people to easily cross. People, yes, they have to look as they're getting out of a street side door, whether it's passenger or driver's side, depending on the side of the road that you're parked on. I do not see numbers, maybe I missed them somewhere, for what the traffic speeds are on State Street and what percentile we are hitting above 30 miles an hour or above 40 miles per hour. In my own personal experience, I haven't seen that many cars on either State Street or Front Street going at excessive speeds, aside from Friday night drag racing, which I'm told the police chief has cracked down on, and to an extent that he feels is sufficient. But if part of the justification for this conversion and one of the metrics that you're looking at is a reduction in those traffic speeds, then it would be helpful for us to see what the traffic speeds we are seeing and what would be considered a significant and beneficial reduction for the final metrics. As a comparable case with the 8th Street conversion, we also looked at traffic speeds for that, and that it was, if I remember correctly, determined that the median speed was unaffected, but that percentile of cars that were in excess of 30 miles an hour or in excess of 40 miles an hour was dramatically reduced because all of the speed traffic is moving more or less continuously rather than smooth flow in one lane and stop and go flow in the other. Also, if you have crash statistic numbers, I did not see that as part of any of these presentations. And that would again be helpful in determining what is the standard right now and what would be standards that we should shoot for, or what we considered achieving a certain objective going forward.
Yeah,
I think
fantastic.
that's going to be one more metric you're going to have to look at called crashes.
Absolutely.
Everything else he has mentioned is already part of the metric. So we just got to see the base that
So
you started.
I would like to suggest that as a part of the metric process, that we do collect some additional before data. I do think most of the data that's been collected by the engineering department is likely pre-COVID, if I'm recalling correctly. And I do think that mobility has changed and would suggest getting some additional data prior to implementation of the pilot so that we've got a more current measure of speeds in particular.
Ms. Walter.
If we're really looking at the metrics and wanting to find success, especially with pedestrian movement, speed, and reactivity, and I would definitely not be in favor of excluding the bike lanes. I'm not going to be in favor of a pilot that doesn't include bike lanes. We already, like Mr. Lewis pointed out, we already have one bike lane there, and we have plenty of space, especially if the idea is to reduce the space for cars, and we have 12-foot lanes right now, and it's 10 feet on Front Street. I don't know what else you're going to do with that space if not put in a bike lane on both sides.
So 4 feet is not a recommended space. So a minimum travel lane next to a minimum bike lane next to a minimum parking lane is uncomfortable for everybody. So we may have the opportunity to consider that, but in looking at the cross-section, I wasn't fully convinced that we would be able to get both two-way vehicles and two-way cyclists.
Well, we already have
with
a
this
bike
pilot.
lane in there, though.
For eastbound, correct.
Right. So that leaves 4 additional feet for another bike lane if I'm doing the math.
Right,
correctly.
which is a minimum unbound bike lane distance. So a 10-foot travel lane, a 4-foot bike lane, and a 7-foot parking lane
Well,
are
I
basically
can't tell
three
you,
minimums.
I don't even know what the bike lane width that we have there now is, so
It's 5 or 6, I think it's 5
I
feet.
don't know.
I'm
Maybe.
perfectly happy having minimum parking and minimum lanes for cars. If
But-
the idea is to slow traffic and to create a place for pedestrians and activate that space, why go to the maximum for a car? Isn't that the opposite of what we're trying to achieve here?
So the maximum for cars, and we were talking about providing
No.
narrowed vehicle travel lanes.
No, we're saying give the minimum that for parking and for travel lanes.
Correct. And
That's what I think she was referring to.
I'd be glad to see if I can work with the city engineer to come up with a pilot cross-section that does include cycling in both
Yeah,
directions.
I'm not gonna approve a pilot project that doesn't include that.
Even at the expense of parking, if that's
Correct.
where it ends up? Okay,
That's
thank you.
And then I guess my final question, because it was kind of vague, and I shouldn't say vague in the answer, I think it was there, but it kind of pinpointing the timeline that you had mentioned with the turn lanes. I mean, as I look at this project, that doesn't seem like a major priority. Left turn lanes, sorry to be specific. So again, if we're talking about space available and what we're doing with it, I guess I'm just curious, is there an essential need for a left turn lane? Or is it that we can keep the flow going?
So I think we're going to find very quickly, after implementing it as constrained as possible, that the amount of vehicles that are trying to flow through two-way, one left turner is going to restrict that entire bounds movement until it has the ability to make
I guess
its
what I'm
turn.
saying is no left turns on it,
So,
period.
so right, if we were to post no left turns, that addresses kind of that congestion issue. However, we're not necessarily facilitating the circulation into the downtown that we're trying to promote with the two-way.
And I understand, I guess, when I reference this, I guess in my mind, what I'm thinking of too is the pilot, where I guess we did have left turns from Pine onto Union, but not through the major 200 blocks of, or the 100, 200 blocks of State Street. So looking more at that minimal left turns, I guess, and reduced to where they're maybe necessary and functional and maybe not, so.
Correct, yeah, and so that approach, takes a minimal approach, and then if we need to make adjustments through the pilot, so be it.
Yeah, and since I was called on, I'll say I second Commissioner Walters, where I would like to see the bikes integrated and do what we need to do in that regard.
During the pilot, correct? And then if the mobility plan comes in different, we change it based on the mobility plan.
Yeah, I'm definitely interested in the mobility plan, but I don't want to see us losing all or losing some of that other modes of transport on State Street while we're doing 2 years.
And neither does the DDA.
Yeah.
But I do want to identify that the mobility plan is what we're paying for and really want to be able to implement those recommendations. Okay.
Any other questions? Comments? Yes. Well, let me see if there's anybody else here first, okay?
I'll let Marty speak first.
No, I'm gonna let the commission finish for right now.
Okay, since
all due
economic
respect.
development is cited as one of the reasons for this, and I'm not going to argue that there's a stark difference in the current level of development and economic activity between Front Street and State Street, I do have some concerns about the case studies used in that they're highlighting seemingly exclusively success cases without looking at, say, in Kalamazoo, for example, here is a section that we changed from one-way traffic to two-way traffic, and here is another section of town that we preserved as two-way traffic, and here were the baseline economic trends, and then how those economic trends change going forward. I understand that sort of data is a little harder to come by than a more comprehensive picture, but it would, I would say, speaking as a person who is used to different sorts of experimental setups from the natural sciences than the social sciences, I like to see nice control groups that I can compare my experimental setup to.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you, Honorable Mayor, City Commissioners. When the discussions first started on this, I had great consternation, particularly on Front Street. There's always issues to take a look at and work on, but I really thought it was too much, too quick. But I will say that as our discussions were formulated and arguments made, became and tried to keep an open mind in regard to State Street and look at it now in terms of as a pilot, that it's a test. We recognize there's going to be wins and failures and to try to gauge what works and what doesn't. So in that sense, I'm supportive of trying a pilot on State Street. I had a recent conversation with Mr. Zoll in regard to identifying the metrics, and I know we're doing that tonight as partly as trying to fine-tune that, but then also getting costs involved, because there's going to be a lot of work, in my opinion, of trying to engage and getting data ahead of time so that we have something to work off of to gauge it during and after the fact of what works. A couple of things that I wanted to bring up, though, was the first one is, and I still have a great consternation on this, is the left-hand turns. Had great in-depth discussions with Mr. Zoll and others, and I believe his words were, it's counterintuitive, Marty. I get your point, it's counterintuitive, but I'm greatly concerned about the safety of pedestrians in regard to adding those conflict points. Typically, and as I've been trained, is with conflict points, there's more risk, there's more chance of vehicle and pedestrian type accidents. And that might be something Mr. Zoll may want to focus on a little bit more tonight. The other one I wanted to point out was in regard to one specific intersection that I think we need to have a much more defined discussion on. And that gets into Whole and West Front. And we've reviewed the warrants. There are positive warrants that because of past accidents and past data there that do warrant a traffic light. And that's been a consternation point as well with past conversations with past city commissions. So I want to bring it up so that we make sure we do have that discussion at a time. On the other side of it, we have requests from Beta that are asking for left-hand turns going southbound off of Whole. And we have requests and support from the fire chief to also have a light there in terms of being able to control that with new technologies to be able to enter and exit through that direction for emergency services. So I think I want to point that out to you, that that's a dialogue that we want to make sure we have as well, so that it doesn't sneak up on somebody at some point and have that full dialogue.
Sorry, I just wanted to ask a clarifying question then. That, are you saying that the light at Hall and West Front would be put in at the same time of this, or we're anticipating it sooner? I know we had four-way stops there at one point, so I didn't know we'd jump to a light now too. So I'm just curious how that time frame, that specific timeline is looking then.
I think that's a great question, and I don't have the exact timeline for you, but Mr. Zoll can answer that. I think that was part of what needs to be tracked in terms of some of the data and certainly communicated.
Yeah, thank you, Marty. As a part of the analysis that we did perform, growing the volumes in the downtown is a typical course of the action to look into the future state, which included the level of service failing for the Hall and Front Street intersection. As a part of the analysis that we did, we included a warrant analysis that shows that it does meet the criteria for the installation of a traffic signal as a part of our study. I would recommend that we continue to monitor that intersection for its operations and determine the right time for its implementation based on observed operations within the field and data that's collected. We need to recognize that there is a period of time to design and then acquire and install those materials, and traffic signals have a lead time of the poles are at least 3 to 4 months. So it's not like we can just decide we need a traffic signal here tomorrow. It is going to take a period of time to actually get it implemented once that decision is made.
I appreciate that. So I guess I would hope that we'd have that conversation soon, because speaking of timing, I still see a lot of people stopping, like it's a four-way stop there from the bridge being closed. So it seems like people are still conditioned to approach that intersection differently than it's designed right now. So I hope that we can have that conversation sooner and act on it sooner while that's still kind of part of people's mode of operation right now.
And we did also engage Beta as a part of our process, and they've reiterated the preference for that signal operation at that location as well.
The infrastructure is there, correct? I mean, that's what
Correct.
those boxes are. They're ready to go if we wanted to install something.
Correct.
Look forward to that meeting soon.
And
Can
then
I ask Mr. Zoll also to address the first question in regard to the
conflict points?
left-hand turns? Yes. Conflict
Yeah, so with a traditional four-legged intersection with two-way operation and all the legs, you have 32 points of conflict. With one of the streets operating as one way, say the main thoroughfare, you reduce that by 8 conflict points down to 24 conflict points, because you know there's no opposing that main street direction. So that does create more points where a vehicle and a vehicle, or a vehicle and a pedestrian, or a vehicle and a bicycle can cross paths. As a result of the increased conflict points, the counterintuitive point to this is generally under two-way operation, vehicle speeds are slower, and that we're ending up with more ability to stop and react to the pedestrians and cyclists. And if we do end up in a crash, they're usually lower severity because we are traveling at lower speeds. So even though there are more conflict points, generally we are less severe when it comes to the total number of injuries in the downtown.
All right. Any other questions? Yes.
Yes, I had a good talk with Beta today about this, and again, they reiterated, as they have in virtually every conversation I've had about traffic patterns, that they want a stoplight at Hall and Front. But they also expressed that for, say, the Bay Line as the most frequent route, but all other routes that use the downtown area, they would expect to maintain the present circulation with westbound on Front Street and eastbound on State Street and turning on Park and, Boardman and Pine as it currently presents. So I would like input from Chief Toller or other, I would say, frequent users of large turn radius vehicles to provide input on if or how they would expect their driving patterns through the downtown to shift, which I would say more than ordinary car users would impact, say, where left turns are necessary and where we might need to preserve certain elements or introduce certain elements to allow safe turns of a certain radius.
So as a part of our process, staff input is a very important part of the decision-making and ongoing evaluation of its success and challenges, which allow us to iterate. Do recall that the streets did operate as under two-way operations prior to 1967. Maybe the vehicles weren't quite as large as they are today, but we did serve emergency services back in that time as well. So I'd be glad to continue the dialogue to gather some specific feedback, unless there's something you wish to share this evening as well.
All right. Any other questions? Well, you've still got more work to do, so. All right, thank you for your time tonight. I appreciate it. Okay. The last item on our agenda is a discussion regarding a request from the Traverse City Area Public Schools for the establishment of a school resource officer at the Central High School.
I was just going to take
Marty, do we?
Certainly. Police Chief O'Brien and myself met with Dr. Van Wagner, Superintendent of Schools, with TCAPS. They are receiving a grant. They've applied for, and it appears they'll be receiving a grant. They're working with both Grand Traverse County and the Sheriff's Department in regard to funding some positions of schools outside of the city limits, as well as they've addressed working with us and made a request to work with us specifically at Central High School. Although that individual would be based there, there could be some activities as well outside over in some of the outlying schools as well. Chief O'Brien is here to prepare or to provide the prepared statements of where we're at with this process of discussions as well as recommendations.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor and Commissioners and Mr. Colburn, for this opportunity. It's awfully hot in here, so I'm not going to talk real long. We presented this slide presentation. It was for Ann Carden when she came here, trying to resurrect a relationship with TCAPS, and it's been a couple years, but we are now in a position with Dr. Van Wagner that he would like for us to have a community police officer, a school resource officer in the school. So this concept of school resource is not new by any means. The Flint Police Department had a school resource officer back in the 50s, and And we talked about Ralph Suffredini, who was our chief. He was a school resource officer in that Flint area back in his day. I recall a seminar that I went to early on, about the early 1990s, and there was a gentleman by the name of Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman. It was over at NMC in the Denos Museum. So Lieutenant Colonel Grossman has come under a lot of criticism lately for some of his work, his research. He has an MED in psychology. He taught psychology at West Point. And he has some books on, he kind of gets into the killing mindset of what the killer thinks like. And I remember him telling me and the other group at the time, this is like 1992, 93, he said that as police officers, you should start wearing your gun in public. You should wear them in the schools, you should wear them in the theaters, you should wear your weapons in churches, synagogues, mosques. He said the domestic terrorist is going to be prevalent within the United States within the next 10 years. I thought he was nuts. I thought, there's no way. And then, of course, in 1999, we had the school shooting in Colorado. So he was very prophetic in what he was talking about. And in the mid-90s, 1994, we came up with, there were a couple violent crime cops and school program. It was Act of 1994. It had some gun-free schools, 1994. And this was right in the advent of my police career, where they were just putting an inordinate amount of money into law enforcement because of what the crime rates and what was going on, particularly in the inner cities. And so let's fast forward to today. In 2021, we've had about 30 years of research on a school resource officer. And it doesn't go without criticism. And in 2021, the Department of Justice asked the question, what are the effects of school resource officers on student outcomes, school safety, crime rates, and disciplinary actions by student demographics and infraction details and severity? The research evidence does not, as a whole, yield support for school policing as an effective strategy to improve safety and security. Though some positive impacts have been reported for school policing, they are fragmented and inconsistent across the studies. School policing has been correlated with harmful effects on students. These harmful effects include physical harm, increased use of exclusionary discipline, suspension from schools, arrest, and differential experiences with school policing dependent on student race, ethnicity, and disability status, and sex. I'm very cognizant of that. I've read that. I know that. I hope that at some point I can gain some type of veracity within this community that I would not stand for that from any school resource officer. What I can tell you has been very successful with our school resource officer in the intermediate school district. Officer Jenny Lynn Oster does a phenomenal job at looking at this triage, they call it, or triad of the triad concept of what the role of a police officer is. They're a law enforcement officer. They have to uphold the law. They're sworn to do that. But you know, they're an educator role, which involves teaching students, staff, a variety of topics related to crime, the law and positive decision-making, and the informal counselor mentor role refers to officers aiding students and at times their families with law-related issues. So there's different hats that a school resource officer wears, and I think that she has been very effective at that, and I applaud her. One of the key recommendations that So out of those two crime acts, the Gun-Free Schools Act and the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994, the U.S. Department of Justice and the Office of Community-Oriented Policing Services, they grew out of that statute. And that's kind of the litmus, what I use all the time is that community-oriented policing. So on the positive side of this, the recommendation from that study is that schools should establish a behavior threat assessment teams. Those teams include school administrators, law enforcement officers, school resource officers, teachers, and counselors participate in these teams to address concerning behavior by members of the school community. So then there's that assessment and the diversion, there's a diversion in out of the criminal justice system. So you're using the social sciences to help this individual, help the family, as opposed to putting them into the criminal justice system. There has to be, one of the criticisms is that school resource officers are not trained in uniform across different bailiwicks, different locations. That's true in any law enforcement capacity. Training is not specific. It's not as good as in an outline area as it is in Traverse City. I can tell you this, our school resource officers are very well trained. They understand their role, their job, they take it serious, and I think that they'll do a really good job. So I just wanted to end with one final comment that I hope I can go off subject, Mr. Mayor.
Go for it.
I just want to point out that today is National Police Women's Day, September 12th, and I want to recognize our Officer Jenny Lynn Oster, Officer Krista Frzinski, Officer Logan Core, Officer Bridget Rosansky, and Officer Mickey Hecko. So, any questions on what we talked about?
Okay. Yes.
So I had a couple questions before comments of any kind. So one is, in this I didn't see, I saw that there's a grant and there's matching positions, and I realized by looking at the dates on these came pretty fast and furious, it looks like, so that might be why some of this information isn't here, but it doesn't say how long this is for. It says after 2 years it might be renewed, and the funding on that. And then the other kind of comment I guess I'm looking for, and it's the theme of the night, it seems. I've heard very positive things about Officer Oster, but I don't see in here what TCAP's matrix looks like. I know you run a very good program for all of our officers. I know we are community-based, and I have a lot of faith in you. But for all the reasons that you've stated in your presentation, I also have some major hesitancy in wanting to go in on a school project. So I guess what I'm asking is the time limit on here, and then also, is there a set out matrix yet, or is this something that everybody's kind of talking about right now?
You want to talk to that, boss, or you want me to?
Well, I can talk to part of it. We have expressed our concern, and it's been slowly growing in terms of the information base. Initially, outside of a grant coming down from the state, we couldn't get much information. I expressed to them I'd like to see a 3-year agreement. Because of the state information and still the lack of flow unless it came in just the last few days, there really has not been a lot of policy detail from the state yet. And so we've been still waiting for that information in regard to their grant program and how to implement. So we talked through that and recognized there's other additional costs involved when you bring on an officer. So we came to the conclusion that minimally we would need at least a multi-year agreement. I don't want to be hiring somebody because of a grant and then the next year turning around and firing somebody. Secondly, I didn't want to then not hire somebody and rob Peter to pay Paul, pulling resources away from the city of one area just to fill this slot. So when we did sit down with the superintendent, we discussed those options, and now the way this does spell out is that they would pay for a total of, through the grant and their funds, 75% of the cost, and we would pay 25%.
For 3 years?
Well, we are trying to get that 3-year, if at all possible.
And then just one last quick one, and yet it looks like from this memo, they want us to have a decision, an official decision by the end of the month as well.
Right, and part of that is not, just to be fair to the school district, it's not just reliant on the school district, it's getting information from the state.
I understand that. But
Yeah,
that's-
keep in mind, it's only a 10-month employee. There's only 10 months that the employee actually works in the school, and I think next week we're going to bring you the Intermediate School District, Northwest Ed. We're going to bring you that contract. It'll have a breakdown monetarily of what
But the
those
question
wages.
I think I heard from Ms. Shamro was that, what is the matrix that the school's going to, or what is the expectation they have on our police officer? Are they to be there and say, okay, you're to be there heavy-handed, or can they accept the way we want to do community?
Exactly. Are we
That's-
not going to get renewed because we
you
didn't
know,
have enough arrests or
You know,
crime didn't change?
yeah, so, I mean, the question comes out, we're going into this contract with them, and they're paying 75% of the bill, and they have a 75% what they want to see have happen. And of course, they're waiting to see what the grant's going to say from the state, so it makes it kind of tough, because Chief, while I have utmost confidence that you have a system that you want to implement, but if it doesn't match what the school wants, we got a conflict walking in. And we got to make sure.
I think the expectation in talking to Dr. Van Wagner, I don't want to put any words in his mouth, but one of the advantages of a school resource officer is that if they do have an active shooter, you got a minute response time. And I don't think we can ever prevent an active shooter, but we can minimize the damage. And I think in talking to him out of Oxford, this has really been a discourse amongst their staff, amongst their school board. They've talked about it. They've gone out. They've hired a security specialist to analyze and to assess the physical part of this. And number one, it's a psychological advantage to have a police officer there. And number two, it's a response time. And I think those are the things that they're actually looking at. And does it boil down to politics? I would guess.
The one
yeah.
thing that Dr. Wagner did fully agree to in that conversation was that the police chief would always have control of the officer in terms of overall administration, and that he agreed to.
I mean, I go back to a time when a certain officer, who was a pretty gruff officer at one point, and he got to be going, and he took on the job as a resource officer there. After a number of years, his whole attitude of working with kids changed 180 degrees. And it was one of those that he more or less became an advocate of trying to find those young folks that are having some struggles and finding ways to get them engaged in different activities and be a more positive influence. So I'm hoping that's how our officers will work, trying to find those folks, as you said, and do that. And I thought it was amazing, and to listen to some of his stories and how he changed his heart, it was amazing to me. So I will leave names out of it, but it was fairly enlightening. So.
I have another question, but I wanted to open it up.
Yes,
Okay,
please.
other
Okay, I'm
commissioners.
sorry.
Few questions. Thank you for the overview and the history on our relationship with community policing in the schools. Where to begin? I got the impression from you that you weren't really in favor of it, like that there were so many disadvantages to.
No, I think that I had already was cognizant of the criticism, and being a law enforcement officer, we get criticized every day. And in Commissioner Werner's opening remarks, I'm just going to put it on the table. These are the criticisms. These are the things that can go bad. That's part of being a cop. So I'm in favor of it. I have been working really hard, diligently, to get a law enforcement officer back into the school. And it was really painful in 2019 to pull that officer out of there But they weren't utilizing us. If you look at the calls for service, they were going down to 0. I mean, they were not, there was a lack of trust or whatever. I don't know. It was a different regime. It was a different person in charge. So I looked at the status, I looked at the data, and I'm like, we're not going to keep a body over there for free if we're not utilizing them. And that's why I pulled the Soffredini out of there, Joe Soffredini, because we weren't being utilized. But there's a different regime now. There's a different boss, and that boss sees the value of what is the positive aspect of a school resource officer. We know the negatives, we know what happens, but there's positive things also that are outcomes of that. And I feel confident we'll get the right body there and get that person that is going to implement that and is going to be a very successful program.
It's unclear to me what the specific goal is, and I feel like, having a couple kids in TCAPS and one at a middle school where they have a resource officer now and they have the dogs come in, and the response from the kids has not been very positive.
Yeah.
And their mental health is already not great. I think, to me, this is a giant Band-Aid solution for a huge societal issue that we have. We don't have mental health services. We don't have enough school counselors. We've systematically defunded public education. We don't have nurses. We don't have social workers. And yet, we have these huge issues. And bringing in a police officer is maybe going to make people feel like better about the situation. But we know it doesn't really change. It's not going to help the mental health of the children. Or the parents sending their kids to school in this day and age. And I see what TCAPS is trying to do. I see what the state is maybe trying to do. They're just trying to really avoid harder decisions that we have to make. And I'm not in favor of this general approach to governing and resource allocation. I know you would find a good person. I have full faith in you and your department to be a good presence in the school. And yet, that's not really going to solve our issues. I don't know what it is we're really trying to solve with this and to allocate these resources for it. I know there's a grant, and so we want to kind of jump on it to say we're a part of the solution. And really, when we look at it, this really isn't the solution in my mind. And so, yeah, we could throw some money at it and say that we're doing something, and then we wouldn't have, maybe we won't have the blood on our hands, but the history shows us that we will, whether we have a resource officer there or not. And I understand what we're trying to do here, but I don't believe that it's going to solve any of our problems.
Well, I think that I too have young kids. I have grandkids that I've adopted, and I have young kids in the school also. And, there's many times I go to the school they go to, and the doors are wide open, and everybody has pretty much free access to that school. And you hate to have a continual lockdown situation in a school. However, I will tell you something indelible in my mind, where Lieutenant Colonel Grossman gave an analogy of Israel. And in Israel, every school kid that goes to school has to go through a metal detector. And there's fences around their schools with armed police officers. Well, in Israel, the police are the military. I know we're not at that point yet in the United States, but there's so many different checklists that you can derive, you can look at, and there's telltale signs of an active shooter. there's boom, boom, boom. And you know, I don't have those in front of me, but I can easily look at those, and the DOJ, the community-oriented policing, they'll give you those telltale signs. They're all there. And there has to be a connectivity. There has to be this teacher feels confident as a team with a social worker, with a police officer, with the principal, that they can confront and talk to the parents and say, what's going on? What's going on with your child? We have some concerns because they're manifesting this behavior. And that's exactly what happened in Oxford. This young man was manifesting some behavior, and he was not asked to leave the school. Or he was asked, and parents didn't come and get him. There has to be an intervention at some point. And I think that's what we're trying to put those type of mechanisms in place. They're not foolproof, and we certainly don't want to just take every kid and, you know, they say they want to be like Frank Zappa or somebody and bite the head off a bat, or, you know what I'm saying? We don't want to just classify every kid as a terrorist. You have to look at the whole picture. And that's, as a team, you can look at that and try to minimize that threat. Go ahead, Commissioner Shamrock.
No, I didn't want to, Ashley. But I guess I was going to say, though, I appreciate, especially coming from you and knowing how you police, where you're coming from with this. But, you know, you talked about how having an officer seemingly deters domestic shooters or attacks. But, you know, I don't have children, but I have friends who have children. I have friends who have children that are, you know, BIPOC. They're mixed race.
Yeah.
They feel uncomfortable, though. So now you're trading one potential psychological discomfort of a potential, maybe, possibly going to be a shooter, for the day-to-day discomfort of students.
Yep.
And that is something that I really struggle with. I see that the CAC is one of the partners, and I do know that you work very closely with them. And to me, there's that little part that's like, oh, it'd be nice if there was somebody there, that if somebody felt like they were in danger at home, there was somebody they could go to. But the more that everything we're talking about, and we don't have the state requirements for this in front of us, everything we're talking about sounds like a social worker. And as Commissioner Walter pointed out, we don't have any in the schools right now. And so I do feel very hesitant, especially without knowing what the state's requiring or anything, and even knowing how well you run programs, of what at the end of the day is the state requiring from us, and what at the end of the day is this officer going to do. I'd rather hire an officer who's a social worker and have them work in that capacity as a social worker if we're not going to get them for schools, than put an officer in who's an officer. And I'm not saying that's even part of the option here or what we'd be doing, but I think, to Commissioner Walter's point, that throwing an officer in because a school shooter might happen, even though, as we saw in Oxford and other places, even when there's formulas in place, at the end of the day, there's still sometimes very little control over what anybody can actually do. And that's my real hesitation here, because of the other side of that coin, and not having all the information that we really need. And it sounds like you guys don't even have all the information. And again, like I said, I see the dates on these. This started on the 31st. And
thereabouts.
yeah, and we don't know what the state's going to require. Again, this goes, are they going to require that we arrest or have so many kids put into certain systems? It's a big unknown. And I guess I would say, I really, unless that contract looks really amazing, very much doubting that this is even though I trust you, that this is a great solution.
One of the things we do know is that it does require a state certified police officer. So that is a requirement that we're aware of.
But that's,
Just so you're aware of that. One of the things I might suggest, though, is that, as you're, I think, aware, there are certain things that the school has to do. They have to report certain incidences. You know, if there's, you know, certain bruising, sexual assault, things of that nature. It's very real. It happens. People don't necessarily hear about it every day because they're children. We don't advertise those things. But one of the things that I see that could be very beneficial out of this relationship is the fact that as the teachers and the administrators get to know our people, and we work with them, that they feel more at ease with that relationship, of working with them to make sure that those types of activities stop in terms of harming the children, and that there's a proper investigation, and that we have access to act in a timely fashion. So I see that as potential positives out of that relationship.
Yeah, the school that my kids go to, there was 2 African-American young students. And I know their mom very well. She works downstairs. Actually recruited her husband to go on our reserves. And Burnell France is he's the Old Mission county deputy. His kids went there also and made a point to talk to them, communicate to them, show them police car. We had our dog. Officer Vershave went out there right during COVID. They had a dog show. He showed them the dog and the car out in the parking lot. These things are all mentoring, and they're getting young people accustomed to talking to the police officers, so there's not this adversarial role that we play. Kids don't have a lot of prejudice. Adults do, but kids don't. It's a learned behavior, and they're very open. They're very open to us. They ask us real tough questions. So I think there's a lot of advantages to that. And our officer would be working in the sporting events, would be working in the public school, in the grade schools. They would make an opportunity there to be present. Very few of the complaints go to the criminal justice system. And generally, I can tell you this, my experience has been where that young person has been in some type of crisis for quite some time, and there's a dysfunctionality within his or her support system. And there has to be, something has to be interjected to get them on the right path. And I'm talking about dysfunctional parents, guardians can't control them. It's a lack of medicine. There's a whole host of different issues, but that's a last resort that we utilize. I don't expect there's going to be any type of, from the school, I think there's going to be pushback from the staff. I'll tell you that right now. At the high school, I think they're going to push back. I did DARE. I was a DARE officer for 10 years. And I got the cold shoulder all the time from a school teacher. I never once was invited into the break room, the teacher's break room, not one time. Now, Jenny Lane goes in the teacher's break room. She's invited in. She's built that trust. And I understand. I understand union employees. I understand the camaraderie. I understand the distrust. But it takes time to build that. I do know that they're having a difficult time, the school systems are having a difficult time filling social worker roles. I don't know why. Could have been something that came out of Oxford. Why the social worker, what happened in Oxford with the social worker, I don't know. I've had 10 applications for our social worker, for a police social worker. There's going to be an intersection there. Our social worker is available to everybody in the community. I hear you. I understand your fears. But the last thing I want is to see my grandkids and what happened in Uvalde and police breakdown. I mean, the police were definitely just, they were at fault. Completely at fault. I don't understand how any officer could do that. Could just stand by. I wasn't there, but so I understand. I understand the criticisms. So either way, I'm here to serve. My department's here to serve, and we'll do the best that we possibly can. We still will respond to the high school, any of the schools that have an active shooter. That's our job, and we'll go in. So.
Yeah. Well, they need a decision by the end of the month. I think the biggest thing is that we're going to want to know exactly what is expected of us from the state grant. And I think that's only fair to you as well as the school administration. I think it's going to be fair to say until we have that, we want to make sure we're all playing on the same fields.
Absolutely.
So I think that's going to be one of the critical.
Loud and clear.
I see it, Marty. So I think that's one of the things that we will have to make sure we get in line before we make a final decision.
Loud and clear.
But understand, it's not because of you at all.
No problem.
Okay.
I understand. Thank you.
Have their hands up.
Go ahead. No, I'm recognizing you, sir.
Okay, I'll try to maintain my composure, but thanks for Ashley for already setting a precedent. I, in this case, fail to see both the clear and specific case that TCAPS is seeking an SRO for, what specific scenario and problems they are seeing that as the solution for. And furthermore, I'm failing to see how an SRO is the tool to address those problems. As Chief mentioned in his presentation, an SRO can wear many hats. They are not just a law enforcement officer. But traditionally, those wraparound services, in the times when my grandmother was a school teacher, for example, teachers, coaches, school secretaries would have provided additional family connection, support services, and the like. In the modern era, we have, perhaps not at current staffing levels, but there are dedicated positions of social workers, of counselors, of school nurses, and other support staff that can address issues of mental health, of violent behavior, of antisocial behavior, of students having various forms of disagreement, and that might affect their personal life, that might affect their social life both inside and out of school, that might affect their academic life, or something else entirely. In your presentation, citing information from the Department of Justice that I would say did a very good job of making the case for the ineffectiveness of SROs at increasing school safety and solving these fundamental issues. You mentioned that, or the report mentioned, that those schools with SROs see higher rates of not just the higher profile arrests and redirecting students to the criminal justice pipeline, but also higher rates of exclusionary discipline in the in-school setting. I have lived that. I have, in my time at West Middle School, as a direct result of non-hostile, non-criminal behaviors and interactions with the SRO that was stationed there, I suffered a disproportionate rate of suspensions and detentions than my peers. As an exceptionally bright student, I would say that that didn't impair my academic progress, but for other students, say a student that already has truancy issues, taking a student out of the classroom for the exclusionary discipline can adversely affect their academic progress. And like you said, or as the report said, the students that are seeing these disproportionate rates of exclusionary discipline are those students from racial, gender, and disability groups that are minorities. In my case, it was directly tied to my disability status. Later on at West High School, West Senior High, I was able to have weekly meetings with a school social worker, and that was a much more beneficial scenario to both me in my own academic success, me interacting as a positive social student in the
Right.
school, and me as a person that could present discipline problems to school administrators, and understanding that beyond a certain extent, discipline problems at school could lead to interaction with the criminal justice system outside of school.
Right.
I see the push for SROs as something that can seem like a solution to improving school safety, especially in the eyes of certain parents, perhaps school administrators, state officials, but I don't see it as one supported by the underlying data and one that is serving the best interests of the students themselves. Yes, there can be psychologically beneficial effects to having positive interactions or exposure to law enforcement, but not just it can make people uncomfortable and cause them to be disciplined both within and outside the school system at higher rates, but it can cause them to be uncomfortable with authority figures more broadly, so that they aren't just not reporting some gang activity, say, not saying we have problems with gang activity in our schools, but if they know that their friends are involved in gang activity, they might not be comfortable not just to report that to the SRO, but based on the position of that law enforcement officer in the school, they may no longer feel comfortable reporting that to principals, teachers, or coaches that could also serve that in that capacity. In the case of Oxford, the lawsuits that have been filed against both the school officials and the parents show that this wasn't something that was solely because of the failure of response of local law enforcement, or that local law enforcement or an SRO station in the school could have addressed, because it was the school officials themselves that were failing to meet reporting standards and were not appropriately addressing issues. In that case, as the lawsuits against the parents have shown, there were issues with the students' behavior that extended and presented a credible threat beyond the school itself, and law enforcement could have been in a position to step in, but they need not have done that on school grounds or waited for it to be an active shooter scenario. They could have gone to the student's house and tried to work with it then. Furthermore, you bring up the case of Israel, and I'd say that's fundamentally very different. We are not a nation with a mandatory conscription and military service. We are not a nation that sees itself either at a state of active or passive war with multiple neighbors.
Right.
We are not a nation that, though we do have a National Guard base right down 72, and we do have a branch of the Armed Services, the Coast Guard, with a station right here in our city, we don't see that level of internal militarization that, yes, you can argue has made the civilian population safer, but that's ignoring the fact that it has led to not just increased criminalization, but economic segregation and disenfranchisement of minority populations in a way that should be something we strive not to do, rather than an example to emulate.
Well, let me qualify the data. The data is inconclusive. It doesn't really tell us that school resource officers prohibit, restrict, encourage active shooters. It's no different than a police car, marked police car, driving down Front Street. We don't know how much crime that marked police car has averted. There's no way to measure that. You can't ever measure a presence, officer presence. So we don't really know that. Those are some of the criticisms that you'll get of the disparaging treatment. And I'm sorry for your interaction with a law enforcement officer. I can see where that could happen. Having special needs children, I understand that sometimes the behavior is not necessarily, it's organic, or there's something physically, mentally wrong. Maybe it's a medicine. But what I'm telling you that a successful school resource officer program looks like is a team approach. The principal, the teachers, the law enforcement officer, and the school counselor working in concert to say, evaluating the behavior, the assessment, who's going to take this? Where are we going to hand this off to so we can come to a conclusion and we can help the student? I've seen Jenny Lynn do that time and time and time and time again at Creekside, which I have a lot of exposure to Creekside. Early on in my career, I was a school resource officer there. I understand the behavior problems. I understand all that. I have had exposure to that. So we want to make sure that that doesn't happen here. Those are the values of a school resource officer. And I think there is a deterrent. I think a bad guy is less likely to go into a place where there's a gun. If you look at these school shooters, you look at just the active shooter, they're bullies. Where do they go? They go to theaters, they go to churches, mosques, temples, and they go to schools. Places that are gun-free zones, and that's where they go, and they shoot people. There's a lot of problems in our society. I hope, pray to God, that doesn't happen here. And that's all I'm trying, that's all, I think it's a good program. I think it's something that we could attach and that we could see where it goes, but we will definitely bring you the parameters, the dynamics of what they expect. Loud and clear.
I think both from the school district and from the state, so we'll work on that.
Okay. All right, any other questions? Yes, Mark.
There was a lot said, so I'll just keep it real brief. I'm a really big fan of community policing, and I was raised in a neighborhood of the high number of persons of color. My father was, and he also was a police officer. I don't know how to gauge the data on whenever there was a car parked in our front yard, when people would drive slower, or what it truly deterred, but I do know that the officer assigned to our neighborhood during my adolescent years, my teen years, he developed a real connection with us that's been lifelong. And despite me having still issues, because to Commissioner Walter's point, it's way more complex than just one officer assigned to a school can handle. And so I still consequently was a troubled, anxious kid, criminal record, dropout, etc. But that individual is still part of my life today. I recognize him when I see him in the community, and part of the impact that he had, I probably could have been in a lot more trouble. My friends could have been in a lot more trouble. Was to Mayor Pro Tem Shamrow's concern, it was a big impact because he was somebody who looked like us, and we knew that actual connection. So when we think about an officer in the school, when I went to school, I had no respect for the officer that was there in my years, but that might have been just my attitude and who I was at that time. But I see that as a continuation of community policing, and probably opposite to Amy's point is that I think, or as Commissioner Treadwell said, psychological positive interactions. I think whatever we can do to improve the relations with our community, and especially our young ones, and our police officers. And I think Traverse City has a good reputation. Your department really does, and only because I still have connection to people, family members that get in trouble and whatnot. They know who you are, they know your staff and your officers, and rarely do I hear bad things. So just to wrap it up, I believe in it, and would like to see the data that was asked for, but also I have some questions. I think one of them was kind of answered, which is you're dealing with Dr. Van Wagner II, and I understand he has bosses, right? Like what does the TCAPS board, what authorities, I was like trying to read through as fast as I can because I'm relatively new and trying to get up to speed, but what impact does the Board of Education have, the TCAPS board have on this, or any say? And then the other question that I was holding on to was, I didn't see anything where it says why it ended in 2019. So it went for 37
Yeah,
years.
they just
and it was-
discontinued using our services. The cost for service went way down to 20 at the high school. I mean, it was less than 20, and there was a lot of personality dynamics that going on there. New principal and the school resource officer that was there, and it was my decision to pull them out.
Oh, was it?
Yep.
And just because they weren't needed, or?
I didn't feel that we necessarily were wanted there, I guess, for a better terminology. I think our relationship had come to a point where we just, and I needed assets back in the detective bureau, because our caseload was, so we had almost 60 calls for service in 2015-16, and then it dove down. So, with the minority issue, we need to diversify our police department. This is one way to get into the younger kids and gain that confidence that exposure to police are not all bad. Again, that's a learned behavior, and get them interested in law enforcement. That's important, that the Native American, the African American, the Latino, they're interested in becoming police officers here. And I think that's another goal that I think is really important.
One more question is, I last understood that Central High School has a security guard on
Several.
staff.
Yes.
And so are they just requesting somebody with a weapon be?
They want a certified law enforcement there because that's what the grant requires. You have to be a certified police officer with
Will this
a license.
officer be replacing security guards?
No. No, sir.
Appreciate you.
Okay, any other questions, comments, thoughts? Okay, we'll wait to hear back. Don't know where it will be heading, but we'll just wait to hear back from you.
Great discussion. Thank you very
That
much.
was a very informed discussion for me. So. Okay, with that, we are on a part of our agenda for public comment. The only comment I do want to make is to remind ourselves, and that includes me more than anybody else, that we have homework to complete by Thursday. That is to submit city goals, those extra things that we want to see staff work on. Remember, that has to be completed by Thursday and turned into the city clerk. I'm saying that because I got to put that on my to-do list also. So, anyway, any other public comment?
They all go to Benjamin?
Huh?
Okay.
They all go to Benjamin. I just send out the first thing. Everything else goes to him, and he figures the rest of it out. Thank goodness. Okay, I see no public comment. With that, yes.
Well,
Sir.
I would just like to say, immediately before this event, and the reason I was late is Tart Trails had their volunteer appreciation party, and they announced a thank you to government entities, namely the City of Traverse City, Garfield Township, and Grand Traverse County, for their cooperation and contribution in support of the completion of the Boardman Lake Loop Trail. And they gave us a nice plaque.
Very good. I'll give that to you so you can put that. Right, with that, unless there's any other thoughts, whatever, we are hereby adjourned.
Outside world. As I get older, things